Good evening and welcome. I'm Stavroula Golfomitriou and I'm the head of the Collections Department at the Getty Conservation Institute, or GCI. It's a pleasure and an honor to introduce tonight's event, which centers on the remarkable artist Lita Albuquerque and the premiere of Dust to Dust, the latest film in our Artist Dialogues series. This series showcases the wide-ranging forms contemporary art can take and considers how those forms intersect with the challenges and opportunities of conservation. Hold on. Each film features a Los Angeles-based artist reflecting on their process, materials, and the legacy of their work. To date, we've completed 12 of these films, all available, as you can see here, on our YouTube channel, with full interview transcripts available upon request. Lita Albuquerque is a visionary artist whose work explores the relationship between the terrestrial and the celestial. Her use of pure pigment speaks to both material fragility and metaphysical vastness. Lita's work challenges the boundaries of art, science, and environment, and she's been a leading figure in land art for decades. She has exhibited around the world, from the polar desert of Antarctica to the beaches of California, and her work is held in major museum collections, including the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Whitney Museum of American Art, LACMA, MoCA, and also here at the Getty Trust. If you happen to be in Rome, anytime between now and August 17th, you can see her work at Maxi, in the group show Something in the Water. Lita Albuquerque Dust to Dust is a 10-minute video and film that offers an intimate look at Lita's artistic philosophy and her thoughts of what it means to preserve not only a material object, but also an idea or an experience. I'd like to extend special thanks to Jill Moniz, our consulting curator, whose brilliant idea it was to include Lita as a subject, adding depth and richness to the project. We're also grateful to Ava Porter, the film's director of photography and editor, whose sensitive and intuitive touch helped bring the vision to life. And, of course, a heartfelt thanks to Tim Whalen, director of the GCI, for his support of the Artist Dialogue series from the very beginning. Following the screening, Lita will be joined by our colleague, Ellen Moody, a contemporary art conservator at GCI, who directed the film and leads the Artist Dialogues project. I'm sure their conversation will offer deep insight into the intersections of art, impermanence, and conservation. After the dialogue, we'll open the floor for audience Q&A, both virtual and in person. If you're watching online, you can submit your questions at any time via the Q&A box on your screen. If you're here at the auditorium, please hold your questions until the end of the conversation, and then approach one of the microphones at either side of the stage. We also invite those of you joining us in person to a reception following the event just outside the auditorium to celebrate Lita and her work. Before we begin, please take a moment to silence your phones, as they say, before every great film screening, so we can watch Dust to Dust. Thank you.
Welcome, everybody. So nice to see such a full room. And welcome, Lita. It is truly an honor to be sitting across from you right now. For this conversation, I was thinking we could focus on the ephemeral works, because I think they bring up some interesting and perhaps provocative questions about conservation and the role that it plays, if any, in your work. And I think this question really came to the fore when Getty, a little while ago, posted something about this Artist Dialogue series, and they posted an image of your work with the question, how do you conserve artworks made to disappear? And this stirred up quite a controversy. There were a lot of comments, and they all were sort of in the same vein, and I just picked one that's kind of representative. The real question is, why should you? And I know that this question is a little simplistic. Your work isn't about disappearance. It's really an ephemeral gesture. But I still think it offers this real opportunity to think about what conservation, what role it can play in your work and in work that's intended to be ephemeral. But before we get into how to preserve your work, I'd like to talk about the work itself. So I wanted to start with just a general question that conservators often ask artists in these conservation-style interviews, which is, what is the experience you're hoping that these works evoke in the viewer and people experiencing them? And I know that's a little bit of an unfair question. I just want to run through a few examples of these works because they're so varied. But I'd love for you to talk a little bit about the impact of placing raw pigment in the environment like this and the experience you're going for.
Well, first of all, I want to thank you, and I want to thank the Getty and the Getty Conservation Institute and everyone on the team who made the film. It's really beautiful. Thank you. And to see it, it was really wonderful when I think that the mission of the Getty Conservation Institute is to promote cultural heritage. And to be on this stage at this moment, to be part of that is very moving for me. And I really want to thank you and thank everybody here and thank everybody for coming. Now, your question, there was a lot of things in your question. I will begin by, let's see, where do we start? I think the ephemeral works, especially the ones that were done, that I did in the 70s, inherently in them is the question of conservation and preservation. So I think that's a really interesting thing to have the Institute interested in wanting to do that, which also means in terms of the future and of legacy, which is really wonderful. In terms of the works, I can begin with saying that it started with two inspirations. One of them was essentially wanting to work, or seeing friends of mine work on the land, directly on the land, and that kind of freedom that could be wanting to work on a blank canvas like a desert, and what would happen if I put color. So I was thinking with a painter's eye. And then one of my really, the thing that inspired so much of this work was seeing Robert Irwin's work and how much it was no longer, as I said in the film, a two-dimensional object on the wall, but that it was about space. But beyond that, it was also that he would do a simple mark, and all of a sudden, the context around it changed. And the context, there was the relationship between the mark and the context, and I was really fascinated with that. And so I decided to, and I was working with pigments. At that time, my studio had a line. It was divided with paintings that I did with my hands, and the other was the rocks with pigment on it. And I decided to just focus on getting rid of painting and starting almost like with my own prehistory and only working with powder pigments and rocks and ground up rocks. The very first piece I did was Malibu Line, and that had a lot to do with concept. The concept was, first, that was the concept. The concept was that, as I said in the film, was that the relationship of a human being in the environment forms a symbol. And so I did what I call a perceptual cross and dug this trench and filled it with blue pigment, and it went all the way to the horizon perceptually to form a cross. So that was the beginning of that kind of ephemeral gesture. I think there's some people here who may have seen this back in 1978. I lived on an artist colony that a lot of my friends lived there, and so they were all wondering, what was I doing? And so that was the beginning of it. Then I went to the desert, And part of it would be, maybe we can click, yes, where I started the idea, not only was it this line going to the horizon, but the idea of the human going toward the horizon of the mountain. And what you have here are 10 figures going toward the mountain there, and then the wind came and transformed the whole piece into much greater than what I could have done. So then from that and being out in the dry lake beds, I started thinking more sculpturally and started thinking in terms of the sky and the rock and pigment pieces you can see, or that too. The Washington Monument was a little different in that that was done for the International Sculptural Conference in 1980. And that was, again, a work, by that time I was really starting to think in terms of seeing things from this greater perspective. And the idea was that if the piece was to dig a trench where the tip of the shadow of the monument fell and fill it with red pigment. I had an image in my mind where I had seen a red pyramid in the interior of the earth. And I thought, maybe that's why the monument was placed there, was to locate this pyramid as the shadow of the pigment, of the monument goes around. The idea was that through the interrelationship of the earth rotating around the sun, casting shadows at the directional lines, it formed a certain geometry that was the site of power. And so it was my first both political and more spiritual work as well.
Beautiful. I'm struck with the high contrast of your work, and you say in the film that it's really important that it leaves this image in your
Yes.
in your mind. And I think it after looking at these pieces for a while and then closing your eyes, there's like this after image, negative. Is that intentional when you think about color and the land and composition?
Yeah, very much so. You know, when I first did an interior piece that was called Materia Prima, that was inside, the after image was a big thing. But in the outdoors, it's not about an after image. It's really about change and how everything, and light. Leonardo da Vinci likes to say that the greatest painter of them all is the sun. So when I did Malibu Line, as I watched it throughout the day, everything around it changed, but it didn't change. And so, and you change as a viewer because of the weather, the dew, everything around your own perceptual system changes, but the color remains constant. And that's what I think is interesting. It remains constant as long as there is a conservation, right, to the work itself. So the work itself is this constant color with everything around it changing. So this kind of back and forth makes that imprint with, of course, the geometry, with the alignment. In this piece, you're aligned not only to the monument and its shadows, but to the directional lines, to the site of power. With Malibu Line, you're in alignment to the horizon. With the rock and pigment pieces I did in the desert, it was aligned to the stars. So there is this deep relationship to the external, to the context. And so context and form are, always interplay with one another. And so that image in the mind is something I'm definitely interested in, because it's also, it's a difference between looking at the sea and being in the sea, right? It's like it talks to you in a very different way, on a perceptual way, it's almost as if the soul responds to those kinds of strong colors.
And it makes you aware not just of the mark on the land, but the bigger picture, like the surrounding environment, right? Makes you notice things you wouldn't have otherwise.
Yes, and you're always thinking about yourself perceiving the work. And so those three things, the piece itself, the context, and yourself, is all part of this system, which I like to think in terms of our lives, right? We're never separate from anything. I mean, when you think of it, we're totally, right now anyway, attached to the earth, right? We never really leave it, except my husband, who's a skydiver and has inspired the Spine of the Earth piece, or when we're on airplanes. But that whole notion of how connected we all are, and how this intricate system of whether it's a planet within a galaxy, within the cosmos, a human being to the earth, to the sun, all of this, it's so important to understand that there is no separation, right? On some level, there's no separation, that everything feeds into who you are at this moment. And I love that. And I think the work is very inspired by that kind of ideas.
Beautiful. You're talking a lot about perception, which makes me think of the light and space movement, and you talked about those formative years in Venice. You talk about Robert Irwin, how lovely it is that we'll be raising a glass to you in the Getty's Irwin Garden after this. It feels like a beautiful full circle. Could you talk a little bit about LA in those days? I know you spent a lot of time on an artist colony in Malibu and then lived in Venice after that.
Yeah, it was really wonderful. I lived in Ocean Park, right next door to Richard Diebenkorn and Sam Francis's studio. From my house, we were on the second floor from the apartment. I could see into Sam Francis's when he was working on the frame pieces, where he just, this giant canvas and just the outside. Diebenkorn, of course, was also teaching at UCLA at the time. It was also a block away from Jim Terrell's Mendota Hotel, where he purchased and made all his Mendota series. So that became part of the conversation. And my studio was in Venice. And my studio was next door to Fred Eversley, to Eric Orr. Then the Venice Boys were all around. Ace Gallery was a very, very, it was, for me, it was almost like grad school. It was where I saw works that I could never have seen, where all the boys gathered. And I do want to talk about a little bit the difference between the boys and the girls. There was. We were friendly, but not taken that seriously. And so all I could do with that is just keep working, But the fantastic thing is that we were all together and we did discuss work, and we were surrounded by work all the time. And then Robert Irwin, who was besides being an incredible artist, was such a teacher, and he really was dedicated to teaching. And I remember seeing his books of notes, and I went to UCLA, and I don't think he actually taught there, but he would give lectures. And then I was part of a group of grad students. I wasn't one of the grad students, but we were all friends. And that he would come and visit in our studios on Abbot Kinney, what is now called Abbot Kinney. And he would talk to us about our work. He would talk to us about his ideas, of course. And so it was this really fervent and really exciting time. There was also the influence of Northern California and the kind of work that was being done there, which was a lot more conceptual, which was more performative. So all of that melded into Southern California and the light and the space, and in my case, light and space and materiality. My work is about light in matter. It's about matter that contains light. So it's very different than the light and space artists in that they work with the media of light, whereas I work with the media of matter. But within that is light. So it was an incredible time. And then the artist colony, then we moved to the artist colony a few years later, and that was a very different kind of scene. It was more like composers and writers and film people, but it was amazing. It was 160 acres of land. It was called the Other Colony in Malibu, and it was so free. And it was there that I grew up aesthetically as an artist, because it faces south, and you could see, it was high up, you could see the curvature of the earth. And I started thinking about all these ideas when I was on that site. And how the edge of the mountain hit the sky, you know, all of, and the light of the sun on the ocean. It really came from being able to be in that kind of nature, with that kind of alignment to the south, with the ability to see stars at night. So I feel very privileged that I was able to do that, and all that for like $60 a month or something like that.
Wow.
At the time, it was those days, you know.
It sounds magnificent. I wonder if you could walk us through your process, because these pieces are super ambitious, and I imagine there's a lot going on at once, right? You have to think about the site, you have to think about the color, the form, resolving the composition. Do you want to choose any one of these pieces
Sure.
to talk about?
I can talk about a few. I can start with with stellar axis, which was, but first I want to say that most of the pieces start with the concept. Then each one, and usually it's concept, which then goes to materials, which goes to location. Sometimes the location, I think concept and location are very strong. In terms of stellar axis, this was, I spent a lot of time in Egypt. I was what do you call it? It was for the Cairo Biennale. I was representing the U.S. for the Cairo Biennale, and so I spent a lot of time there. And every time I would go there, whenever I was either near the pyramids or any of the monuments, it was almost as if I could hear the stones. It was very strange, and I would still kept getting images in my mind. And one of these images was seeing the Earth from space that had nothing on it but gold-tipped pyramids, all aligned to the stars all around. And I thought, oh my God, what a vision, you know, what an image. The awareness that the stars are, of course, under us, on the side of us, they're everywhere. And I knew that, and we all know that at some time there was that kind of mapping of aligning monuments on the planet. We still have remnants of that. And I thought, well, you know, I can't do pyramids, but I could do points of stars. I could do star shadows on the ground. And at that time, I was doing a lot of public work, and I was very kind of stuck in there, and I couldn't figure out how I was going to do this. And then it took years. And then one day I was on an airplane, and I said, oh, I know. I'll start both at the North and at the South Poles, as if, you know, I was like going next door. I was surprised. But then I worked with Rochelle Fab, who was my studio manager at the time. We researched how the hell do we get there. At that time, not too many, there were expeditions. We even thought we could go down this expedition that was happening at the North Pole for people who believe in the flat Earth, and they think that there's a hole in there and that you go down. I was even going to do that. So anything to get there. Then I found out that the National Science Foundation gives grants to artists and writers to go to Antarctica, and we applied, and it took a long time. We actually got it immediately, and then something happened, and then it took 3 years. And so I had a whole team working here, and it took me a while to figure out what I was going to do. I thought I was going to do what I did in Egypt, but you can't have particles, talk about conservation. You can't have particles in Antarctica. Everything that you bring has to be taken out. Talk about conservation, ecology, everything is pristine and has to be done that way. So I decided to make spheres instead and do 99 of them that would represent the brightest stars in the southern hemisphere, and worked with an astronomer. We were a team of 5, and we placed them in a 400-foot diameter area and align them to the brightest stars in Antarctica. So conservation for this kind of work is a different thing in that they're more object-like. However, the location for this is the South Pole, right? So the reason, then as I did the work, I realized too how important it was to go to the poles and to understand the difference between the two, what was happening there, and that then I had this kind of, not really a fantasy, but I started thinking about if you take 2 stars at the North Pole and you take 2 stars at the South Pole, and the Earth is rotating through the axis of the Earth, it's as if what happens is almost, if you take that light going through with the rotation, it's as if it's the double strand of the DNA connected to the stars. So for me, doing the work is so exciting because this is what happens. I do work and then these things, you start thinking about all these other connections. And so, yeah, I don't know if I answered your question.
No, that's great. Let's talk about Spine of the Earth, because I think this is a really interesting piece that's had many lives.
Yeah, like Spine of the Earth was a really interesting piece. I first did it in 1980 in the Mojave Desert. And it was a very simple piece where I was going to do all these symbols across a spiral, a square, a circle, and a diamond. And then I had these wooden, what I call sundials at the north, east, and west. And then the south was a rock. But the piece, when I was on the ground, you couldn't even see it. It was so flat. And so it was only that when you went up in the air that you could see what the work was about. So again, that made me think about what happens, the difference between our perspective here and a higher perspective physically. And then in 2012, the Getty Museum did their first PSD art that included an ephemeral performance part, and they wanted me to recreate Spine of the Earth, but it couldn't be in the desert. So they said, go find a place in LA in a park. So this was an amazing park called the Baldwin Hills Scenic Overlook. But I decided that instead of pigment, I would use people. And that's when I had 300 volunteers come, and they were, the skydiver came in the middle, and then they spiraled around her, and they went down the hill. So that was a very different iteration of Spine of the Earth.
The skydiver wasn't your husband, was he? Was the skydiver your husband?
I'm sorry?
Was the skydiver your husband?
He was supposed to be, but broke his leg. And we ended up having a friend of his who's a female skydiver. The third iteration was last year, in January of 2024, at the La Patinoire Royale Gallery in Brussels, where they fell in love with Spine of the Earth, and they said, you've got to do it. Can you do it in an indoor space? And I said, I don't know. and I started figuring out how to do that, because the ground had to be strong enough to be able to do the drawing. But I ended up recreating this project for an indoor space, and that's a whole other consideration in terms of maintaining that. And
so with this work, it has the same title but completely different forms each time. Do you think of it as the same work?
Yes.
It's all one.
Yes,
and the same.
in this particular one, yes. And Spine of the Earth having to do, again, with that verticality. I mean, it's not vertical, but the verticality of the spine. And it came from, the title came from how Australian Aborigines sit with their spine to the earth in this kind of configuration. And so I was inspired by that.
We've talked about what acquiring your works means, and what I guess I'll ask it now. What would you say to institutions that are looking to acquire a work like this?
I would say it's easy. Buy it. All you have to do is get the rocks, store the rocks, have the pigments. You can buy the pigment anytime, and then there would be what's called a protocol of how do you put this together.
And that's what we're looking at right now. We don't expect anybody to be able to read this, but you get a sense of we have a map, we have some instructions, we have a list of materials. How exacting are those instructions?
They're exact. There was, because it has to be done in a very certain way. In this case, I actually had 3 tons of decomposed granite fly from LA to Brussels. I could not find the kind of decomposed granite I needed, strangely enough, there. And then it has to be, you have to stabilize it. And it's a whole process of how long it takes to stabilize it. And then it's hard enough for me to walk on. And then I can do the pigment drawing on top of it. So it's quite precise. And the spiral, even though it is done by hand with the string and very low tech, but it still needs that kind of precision.
But it can totally be done by someone else other than yourself.
It could be,
yes.
yeah.
Yes.
But at that time, yeah, I mean, we work together, and can be done by somebody else.
And are there any other key qualities to your work that are important to preserve? Is it important for pigment pieces that it be the exact same chemical pigment, for example?
Well, that brings up the thing of being safe. And so I work with toxicologists. I make sure that the pigments that are used are organic and can be used in the environment. So that's a number one. Yes, besides that, also the quality of the particles is important. It's that sensitive that some pigments are very fine and fly out. Others are they're particles. So that's important as well, what kind of pigment it is. I think the element, it has to be the materials that I say it is. Like even the salt. I just did at the Maxi Museum in Rome. I'm actually showing a film and with an installation with salt, and we had to find the right kind of salt. And there's all kinds of salt, and it has to be a certain quality.
So then do you retain samples in your archive to
Yes.
keep track of what?
Yes.
Yeah. Great. I want to leave some time for questions from the audience, but before we jump into that, I think I want to ask you about the Woolsey fire of 2018. You lost your studio and home, which is just devastating, and I know you're still mourning that now, and it's the experience of so many people just recently in our community, artists and so many who've lost their homes and studios, and wondering if that experience of loss has shaped at all the way you think about impermanence and creation and maybe archiving and documentation.
Yeah, of course. Well, first of all, I want to say, if anybody in the audience has lost their homes in this recent fire, my heart goes out to you. It's really, it's quite something to, in fact, lose archives but anything in your home, which is your life, in terms of what you've accumulated. But in terms of answering your question, I think the thing that I got out of it the most is, in fact, impermanence, and therefore that everything is impermanent, and that all we have and all we're in is a cosmic process, and to accept that, and to, if you can, right, as a human being, it's very hard to accept that, but if one can, then freedom that comes from it is tremendous. And so now what happens is the way that I create comes from that kind of freedom, which is, a rare kind of thing to be able to understand that, yes, worlds come and goes, civilizations come and go, but creativity and who we are and the spirit is what remains. And I think that was the most powerful lesson I got. Of course, archiving and documentation is key as well, to be able to have that, and we continually have to do it, especially living here. So
that's a beautiful place to close. If there are any questions, I believe you don't have to get up and come to a microphone. We actually have runners, so if you just raise your hand, and if we have any questions from our online audience, we can go back and forth. Yes, sure. Right up in front here. Wait for a microphone so that our online audience can hear you.
Hi, Lita. So good to see this whole background and a little bit of a few of your amazing works. You started to speak a little bit about your feelings towards having other people replicate your work and letting, the process of letting go of the idea that, I have to be the one to do it. I do it a certain way and with certain love. And I was sitting here thinking, I've never heard of an artist putting it out there with specifics for other people to replicate their work. And I thought, how glorious. And how did you come to deciding to do that? Having others replicate your installations.
Oh. Well, because I think a lot about my doing this ephemeral gesture, but then there is the public who wants to see it, right? And I think that's where it needs to live on. And it is a big thing to come to that. I mean, I even at times thought, what am I saying? Am I really saying this? But I am, because I think it's so important to have, to think in terms of a legacy, to think in terms of the future. And the one thing I learned, it wasn't, when I redid Malibu Line on the property where we live, it turned out to be like a coming home, which was kind of wonderful and very healing. But what was wonderful about it was that thanks to land, and Christopher Mangum James, I think, was here. Oh, he's right there, who supported the project. We had it open for 2 weekends, twice, I think, and the public got to see it. And the difference for me to be able to gift that, to be able to have people able to see it, and then for me to experience them looking at it, it makes it live on. And I think that's how I'm able to do that.
We have a question from one of our online audience members.
So, what effects does the introduction of pigment into the environment affect it ecologically?
I didn't get that.
Oh, sorry. What effect does the introduction of pigment into the environment affect it ecologically?
Affect what?
Yeah, the environment in general.
I'm very conscious of that. And so, like I said earlier, I use pigments that are organic. And so I'm very aware that I'm not, I'm conscious not to affect the environment in ways that are harmful.
Lita, hi, it's Leslie. You're so incredible, and your big picture concepts are astonishing. And I'm wondering about on the micro level, as viewers navigate these larger, installations, it's almost like a choreography. What do you want the viewer to experience when they're near the actual pigment touching the land versus from a larger, perspective?
Oh, that's a good question. What the magic, number one. As I was talking about earlier, is how what happens with this constant color in the environment, where everything else around it changes and it remains there. There's something there's a certain aliveness in the material itself. There's a certain aliveness that you don't experience in any other way but to be that close to it. And there's a certain mystery. And that's what I'm hoping people to experience. Besides, the whole, but mainly that. I mean, for them to look at that, and that's what, besides the bigger picture, for the intimate picture, that's what it is. And the beauty of these particles that we don't think as particles, we just see the color, but they're actually almost alive, even though they're inorganic.
We'll take another question here, second row, and then third row afterwards.
Hi. I just was curious if you could touch more on the performative aspect of your practice from the very beginning, with working with, students out in the desert for site-specific pieces, to even your paintings, to your films, and how performance and dance is part of that process.
I didn't get it. I'm sorry, could you repeat that? I didn't.
I was saying, could you touch on the importance of performance in your work?
Okay. Well, I did start out, my biggest desire as a child was to be a dancer. And so a lot of my work does come out of that kind of movement. I'm interested in movement. And performance became this natural progression from that. The recent body of work that I did, in fact, for the Cone Gallery, the show that I did in September for the Getty's PST, which I called Earth Skin, had these paintings that were done they were performative. When I was in the studio, it was really a performance doing that. I'm interested, just like in these pieces where the body is always implied, it's the body, it's the human also. And then the importance of engaging also a lot of humans. And when I went from pigment to people in the Spine of the Earth project, that was a real shift. And that came from the power of seeing, of that kind of motion, essentially. I don't know if I answered.
Lita, your works, though I follow your works for more than 40 years, has a sense of fragility and eternal quality. They're so fragile and they're so timeless. And I'm particularly intrigued by your piece that you've done on Washington Mall. How the hell anyone can get permission to do something on Washington Mall? And you, if I remember, had only 24 hours for this piece, and you have to reconstruct the earth.
So he's asking how you got permission to install the piece on the Washington Mall.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I feel very blessed. I've been able to do projects in extraordinary places. This was a very interesting thing. Marsha Wiseman was a patron of mine, and she was also with Walter Hopps on the committee. It wasn't a project I did out of the blue. I was part of the International Sculptural Conference. And so there were a number of works all around the city, not so much on the mall. And so I had to make a presentation to the government. You can imagine today, but and what I did, I actually made a small obelisk. I brought sod from California because it was in February and there wouldn't be any there. I brought pigment. I made the presentation, and at first there was a friend of mine who was an art critic at the back, and she kept going, like I was not doing well. And then I brought the sod out, I put the obelisk, I cut the chevrons, I put in pigment, and they said, "Oh, we see nothing wrong with that." And let me have it, let me do it. Of course, I think having Walter Hopps and Marsha Wiseman in my pocket was really nice. Bless their souls.
But was it exactly that you were allowed only 24 hours for this piece?
Yes. It was supposed, it could only be for that day.
It's amazing.
Yeah. However, Henry Hopkins, who then became the director, well, he was at San Francisco Museum of Art and a lot of places, said that at one point they were thinking of making it into a permanent work, meaning with stone maybe, and that would be really amazing. It would, if we did that, I think it would be considered more of a clock, as opposed to what the intention really was. So, but yes, I would do it if it was only for that one day. June 7th, 1980. Is that your birthday, Tom? Yes, it is. Oh, wow.
We have a question up center back.
Well, Lita, you've done so many incredibly impossible things and achieved so much, and you have such crystalline intention around everything. Is there something which you could speak about now in front of this distinguished gathering here? Is there a dream of something that you would like to do that you haven't yet been able to do, but if you were given permission to do whatever you wanted, what would you do?
That's a Hansel Rickover's question. Yes. What is your work that has not been done? Well, I'm in process of working on developing the third film of my trilogy. And the trilogy is about a 25th century female astronaut who comes to the planet to remind us of our connection to the stars. And the first one was, as she comes to the Earth, she crash lands and forgets her mission. The second one, she comes back and tries to connect with the human beings by giving them gifts of light, but she does not know how to do it, completely fails and goes back. The third one, the working title is Everything is Light, where you can imagine from that title what the end result will be, hopefully, and it's right now in development and quite complex, and I'm hoping it's going to happen. And there's more, but that's right now. I also have another project that I would love to do that I'm calling the Mediterranean Project, or the Remembrance of the Lost Language of the Cosmos, and it would be done around the Mediterranean and different sites, I think 9 sites, where there would be pools of red pigment so large that they would contain your periphery, like all you could see is red. And they would be done simultaneously as a performance. And it's almost an impossible project, but it's something I think about actually.
All right.
And it means, and what it means is that the lost language of the cosmos is about connectedness, is that if we all did this in this very historical part of our history of the world, and that we do it simultaneously with red, which has all the symbolism you can possibly imagine, as we all know, and in that kind of part of the world, the Middle East and the Mediterranean, that would represent that the language of the cosmos is, in fact, that we are together.
We have a question from our online audience.
So what does conservation mean to you?
What? Sorry.
Sorry. What does conservation mean to you?
Well, it's really interesting. I love Ellen's questions, and I've been thinking about them quite a bit. In the beginning, conservation meant repair, meant I visited the beautiful painting conservation studio here, and how incredible it is to see these Renaissance paintings and see how to make them come back to life. But then I realized that it's much more than that. It's about stewardship, right? It's about being is that the right word? Yes, stewards of the work. And it is about holding that cultural heritage. And I think that's what conservation and preservation is.
Seems like a great place to end it. If we're ready to go raise a glass. Thank you all for joining us, and thank you, Lita.
Everybody. Thank you, Ellen.